So I know it's basically February and these annual wrap-ups are usually done at the very beginning of the year, but I only just started this channel, so this feels like the best time to do it. Hello book lovers, my name is Maria, and welcome to Bibliclore and Mint. If you like book reviews or rants or need new book recommendations, you've stumbled on your new favorite channel. So hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on a video. I read 44 books in 2024, and overall it was a pretty great reading year, minus a slump that hit me from September to December. I'm recovered now, no worries. My reading related goals in 2024 were to focus on getting through my physical TBR, read less books than the year before. I read 84 books in 2023, and I think that was a little bit of a red flag for my mental health at the time. And I also wanted to exercise more DNFing just to make sure that the books I read were ones that I was likely to enjoy. Since I was reading fewer books in 2024, I wanted to spend most of that time with books that I really loved and really wanted to get to. I'm gonna go over each book individually, but before I get into it, let's take a quick look at some analytics. I track my reading pretty religiously over on Goodreads and now Fable, but I also use a spreadsheet and a Notion dashboard. It might be a little overkill, something I'm hoping to simplify this year. Anyways, let's get into it. So I am editing and I realized that I didn't finish the analytics portion of this video when I filmed originally. So you're gonna get analytics from me, which worked out nicely because as I was editing this video, I came up with a few more interesting data points that I wanted to share. So yeah, let's get into it now. Okay, these are my reading stats for 2024. This year, I read 44 books. My original goal was 36 books because I wanted to get to about 3 books per month. Those 44 books totaled to 20,409 pages. I do keep track of the pages manually as opposed to just going with what Goodreads or Fable say because they're not totally accurate. And this is a data point that I really wanted to hone in on this year. So I did keep track of that myself. My longest book was Kingdom of Ash, and my shortest book was Tender is the Flesh. The amount of time I spent reading is an estimate 331 hours. I calculate that on a 1 page per minute pace, which is my average. 331 hours equals to 13.79 days straight of reading. No sleeping, no eating, no breathing. I found 18 5-star books. Now, I noticed that I gave a lot of 5 stars this year, and I think that goes back to really being intentional with the books that I picked. Since I wanted to read from my physical TBR, and the books that I own physically are usually ones that I know I'm gonna like, this stat makes sense to me. 20 of the authors that I read from this year were new to me, and I had an average rating of 4.1 stars, which I'm really happy about. And that's it. Back to past Maria for all the book reviews. Have fun. The first book I read in 2024 was Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Ross, the second in the Letters of Enchantment duology. I absolutely devoured Divine Rivals when I read it. I'm almost 100% sure I finished it in one sitting, like started reading it one afternoon and didn't put it down until 2 in the morning. The ending of that book was so intense that I remembered staring at my wall for a solid 10 minutes trying to process it and then immediately looking up when the sequel would be out. Now, while Ruthless Vows is undeniably beautifully written, Rebecca Ross's prose is stunning and the retro wartime magical realism setting is cozy and charming. I found myself a little disappointed. Like I said, we built up to the incredible high stakes at the end of Divine Rivals, and while Ruthless Vows was enjoyable, it didn't quite deliver on the tension I was hoping for. That said, Roman and Iris's relationship remains the highlight. Their letters are heartwarming, and Ross masterfully captures the intimacy of words of affirmation as a love language. I'm personally more of a quality time love language girly, but this is what I imagine 2 people with words of affirmation as their #1 love language to be like. Overall, it's an enjoyable read with some standout characters. Even the side characters all got time to shine. Addie, Marisol, the story of the gods that are at war, the tea around their relationships is so juicy and really is what kept me engaged. The third book in the original Red Rising trilogy and one of my favorite series to date, this book brought the trilogy to a satisfying conclusion. Red Rising is often pitched as the Hunger Games in space, which is true to an extent, but honestly, it doesn't do the entire body of work justice. About 50 pages into the first book, there's a plot twist that completely subverted my expectations, and from that moment, the series never stopped surprising me. Pierce Brown writes at a breakneck pace. You're guaranteed to be somewhere new with each chapter. For me, that pacing hits just right and scratches an itch in my brain that I didn't know needed scratching. Funny enough, I actually started Red Rising while waiting for a flight, which got delayed multiple hours, and I finished it while on the plane rides to and from that destination. As I closed the book in the last 30 minutes of my flight home, this lady from across the aisle who had apparently been watching me most of the flight goes, "Is that a good book? You didn't put it out at all." To which I had to say, no duh. If that doesn't convince you to pick up this series, I don't know what will. Pierce Brown also excels at character development, making everyone in this story feel incredibly real. They are complex, flawed, with strong morals. They make decisions you wouldn't expect. This feels like I'm reading the personal logs of real people in history, which of course it isn't. This is sci-fi and not real at all. In hindsight, the more I think about it, Red Rising feels like a prequel to the main story, which really starts in Golden Sun and carries through to Morning Star. Morning Star wraps things up perfectly while leaving room for the next series. Iron Gold. I didn't read Iron Gold immediately after Morning Star, but it's worth mentioning here. Set after a time jump from the original trilogy, this book introduces new characters while revisiting some familiar faces, navigating the world post-trilogy. It's definitely darker in tone and themes, and I don't want to give too much away, but it ends on an insane cliffhanger. Again, Red Rising is one of my favorite series in my adult life, so I'm a little bit biased, but I really want everybody to pick this up. I actually got one of my best friends hooked on it. She also kind of had that moment in the first 50 pages where she couldn't stop. And now me, her, and another friend, we all have a group chat where we just talk about our thoughts as we read. Yeah, I totally recommend the Red Rising series, if you couldn't tell. The next series I want to talk about is Once Upon a Broken Heart, which I didn't read in succession, but I did read all of them in 2024, so I'll talk about them here. I give this series overall a 3.5 stars. I'll put my breakdown of star ratings here. All I have to say is Book Talk made me do it. My For You page was flooded with Evangeline and Jack's fan art. You know the one. I'm gonna put it up on the screen. Tell me you wouldn't see this and then find out that it's a scene from a book and then not read it. The first book was definitely my favorite. Stephanie Garber really leans into the fairy tale style, which is honestly really unique, and I give her props for fully committing to that. The settings are magical and immersive, and the plot twist at the end of book one hooked me. You wanna know what else hooked me? Jax's introduction. That was a little bit insane, and his first interactions with Evangeline, you can tell that he's obsessed with her but doesn't want to give in, and she has absolutely no clue, which is my favorite trope. However, the pacing and, dare I say, plot quality dipped in Ballad of Never After and Curse for True Love, leaving me a little bit underwhelmed by the series overall, in hindsight. Regardless, I still read them cover to cover. I honestly needed to know how this ended, and there were some big moments in these books that I look back on that do impress me. The idea behind the bigger story, or rather the fairy tale, was fascinating. But the in-between, the scenes between those big, juicy plot points, most of the time felt a little rushed. Overall, again, I give the series a 3.5. It's worth noting that I did not read the Caraval series before or between this. I was honestly much more intrigued by the story of Once Upon a Broken Heart, and all it took was one person telling me I could read it without reading Caraval for me to just dive in. Let me know if I should read it though. I'm totally open to it. Billy Summers by Stephen King. You'd usually reach for a Stephen King novel if you wanted more horror and thrills, but I'd say that Billy Summers is primarily a character study. We get to know Billy really well. He's an anti-hero, a war veteran turned gun for hire. Billy does morally gray things. for example, murder, but within his own moral constraints. Billy also hides behind what he calls a dumb self persona, which is juxtaposed by a sharp inner monologue that reveals how smart he really is. Billy is also a book girly. He's always reading, and when he finds himself with a ton of free time in this story, he starts to write a story of his own memoir, which is how we get his backstory, and I thought that was a really interesting tool for delivering this lore, which is crazy. It's crazy lore. This book feels like Stephen King was telling the story of a real person because the things that happen here don't feel plotted. There are moments where it feels like he writes himself into a situation and then has to write himself out of it, which was fun to witness. Most notably, this happens like halfway through the story where we're introduced to a situation and a new character that I didn't expect at all. And the ending, I don't think I've ever experienced an ending like that before. It was definitely an experience all the way through, one that I never really knew where it was going. A final note on this one, I recommend reading The Shining before reading this book. It's not exactly necessary, but there is a fun Easter egg that I think you'll enjoy if you have the context from The Shining. Again, this is a 5-star read for me. Last time, in my first video, I was drinking a white monster out of this exact same mug. Now I'm having a coffee. Next, I read Bride by Ali Hazelwood, which I got through my library on Libby to my Kindle. This was my first Ali Hazelwood book, and I didn't expect to like it as much as I did. I had such a good time reading this. I just loafed on the couch for a whole day and didn't surface until about 2 a.m. There's a pattern here of me reading until 2 in the morning, if you couldn't tell. This book fully leaned into the contemporary paranormal genre, which I'm not familiar with. This is my first foray into it, but I'm here for it. RFMC's name being Misery Lark, there's a modern gothic vampire city and a cozy lakeside were setting. We even get a brief explanation on the finances of the werewolf pack. I found that so funny, but such an awesome detail. I also totally got a vocab lesson with this book. It happened at least once a chapter where I had to use the dictionary function on my Kindle to search up a word. At this point, I've read enough Ali Hazelwood books to know that that's just her style. She has a thesaurus built into her brain somehow, and I kind of love that she embraces it. I love that she's not willing to dumb it down for us layman's termers. That's not a word. Yeah. Now, the romance here is chef's kiss. We get tension from literally the first chapter. There's a marriage of convenience trope, a little bit of forced proximity too, with a dash of star-crossed lovers. Misery being a vampire and Lo being aware they're enemies and incompatible in so many ways. But Lo, he's a fierce protector and the alpha, and he's just so responsible. And as their relationship progresses, that's very much a part of their dynamic. And you know what? Misery needs that. She has very deep feelings of not belonging and has kind of just embraced being alone. Besides her best friend who has come to know her like a sister, Misery has no company. Haha. Anyways, I loved this. It was so fun, and I'm hoping for another installment in this world. From what I've gathered, Ali writes books with characters that live in the same universe. Sometimes they have cameos in each other's books. I am fingers crossed for another in this one. Next up is Void Moon by Michael Connelly. My husband and I traded book recommendations at the start of 2024, and this was the book he selected for me. Void Moon got him back into reading for fun, so it was cool to see what aspects of this story resonated with him and with me, because I did really enjoy it. First off, let's talk about the setting, Las Vegas. Having been there a few times myself, I could practically smell the stale cigarette smoke and hear the slot machines rigging as I read. Even the scenes out in the desert reminded me of hikes I've been on out in Nevada. Note that it's not a prerequisite to have been to Las Vegas to enjoy this novel, as Michael Connelly does a great job of painting a picture of Sin City in the early 2000s, but it's a nice bonus to have your own memories overlaid with the story. Second, the story is well paced. As a heist novel, there are obvious high-stress moments, and those are written incredibly, but even the slow moments, the build-ups, play with tension in a way that had me holding my breath for the next twist. I enjoyed the characters, especially Jack of Spades Karch. I think that's due in part to the fact that I listened to part of this book on a road trip, and the voice actor for Jack really sells how unhinged he is. But Connelly clearly put some hours into Jack's characterization and backstory. He's multifaceted, and everything you learn about him is a detail that comes into play sometime in the story. I had a lot of fun reading his scenes, like a lot of fun, even though he's absolutely insane. Yeah. And our main girl, Cassie, she's the kind of character who simultaneously has you rooting for her and also wanting to punch her in the face with some common sense, which on one hand I get because she's making some very realistic human decisions, but on the other hand, so frustrating. I give this duology 5 stars. 5 stars for One Dark Window, 5 stars for Two Twisted Crowns. I have nothing but good things to say about this duology. The standout is definitely the magic system, the machinations of which are a mystery in this story, but there is very clearly a trick afoot. There are loopholes and catches, and it keeps you on your toes the whole story, trying to figure out exactly how they work. There is very clearly a theme of knowledge is power here, and there is one character here that knows it all. I'll leave it at that. I also really liked how Rachel Gillig leaned into creating a world that felt very mystical and dark. This town is literally shrouded in mist, and I had such an easy time imagining the gray, feudal world that these characters inhabit. In the first book, we are introduced to Elspeth Spindle, who at a young age was cursed to have this thing stuck in her head. It's called the Nightmare, and we get introduced to it pretty early on. The conversations between Elspeth and the Nightmare that go on in her mind are so fun. I'm a sucker for a morally gray character, and the Nightmare, given its name, is slightly darker than gray, but that's fine. Now, the main reason I picked up this book was for the promised romance between Elspeth and Mr. Raven Hooked-Nosed You. I love when an author isn't afraid to give a character a prominent feature. Now, One Dark Window ends on an amazing cliffhanger that takes you into Two Twisted Crowns, and Two Twisted Crowns takes the story through a journey that I didn't expect. We explore different character dynamics here, and I don't think it gets talked about enough, probably because it's the second book and people don't want to give out spoilers, but honestly, I don't care. Renelm Rowan, the man that you are. Period. Anyways, this has a satisfying ending. It's a bit predictable, but the journey is so fun. And Rachel Gillig is coming out with another book this year. I know I'm going to be first in line for my copy at my public library because we are still continuing with a no buy year. For anybody that was wondering, if you watched my first video, I have successfully made it through almost January without buying any new books. So we're keeping that going. Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki. It's getting such a high rating because the insights on finances are great, and it's interesting to get a peek into how the 1% think. Past that, I feel like I was being gaslit to keep an open mind from page 1, partly because there are reflection questions in this edition at the beginning of each chapter, and there's a reminder to keep an open mind as you reflect. There's also a whole chapter dedicated to telling you that if you don't keep an open mind, you're poor. You're also gaslit into thinking that getting involved in real estate is the only way to be financially free, and that if you don't have an insanely risky investment portfolio, you're gonna die without a penny to your name, and your children and your children's children will hate you for not setting them up for financial success. But if you take all that with literally the tiniest grain of salt, there are some key insights that you can glean. Here are the ones that I'm taking away. First is that financial literacy is key, and most people, me included, don't know enough about money management and life planning. And the financial landscape is always changing. What was true for one generation could not be true for the next. Financial literacy is a lifelong endeavor. 2, an asset is not truly an asset if it creates expenses. Investing in assets that generate income is the way to go. 3, corporations are how the rich get rich. Find a way to shelter your money. 4, if you're not passionate about real estate, don't get involved in it. Thank you for giving me that out, Robert. Get into businesses that you are passionate about, and it'll make it easier to feel motivated about making money that way. And 5, this was a very sobering realization. How long would you survive if your main source of income disappeared right now? If the answer makes you uncomfortable, do something about it. Whatever. This book accomplished one thing: getting me interested in really taking charge of my finances. I was doing the basics before, but the points I kind of took away made me realize I should kick it up a notch, probably. So yeah, thanks for bullying me for 300 pages, Robert. It worked, I guess. I wanted to pick up these books all in my hand, but I can't because I have this thing. But the next books I want to talk about are Empire of Storms, Tower of Dawn, and Kingdom of Ash. It took me about 1.5 years to get through the series. I read A Court of Thorns and Roses first, and this has a different vibe from El-Mohtar. You can tell that this was Sarah J. Maas's early work, and sometimes it's hard to go into an author's backlog, especially when you've read their most current, most stylistically refined work first. But this was fun. It reminded me of reading when I was in high school, and the story in the first few books is light yet fleshed out enough to keep you going. For those wondering, I read Assassin's Blade 4th. Not a common reading order, but that's just how it played out for me. I don't really recommend that order. The lore that we get there is alluded to in the first 3 books of Throne of Glass, so it would have been more impactful to get it first. Reading it 4th also just puts a stop between Heir of Fire and Queen of Shadows, which is honestly criminal. You want to go straight from Heir of Fire to Queen of Shadows. Period. Now in 2024, I finished up the series with the Empire of Storms and Tower of Dawn tandem read. I have the tabs that kind of told me where to go. And I stand by the tandem read, especially after what I just said about the stop that Assassin's Blade put between Heir of Fire and Queen of Shadows. I'm telling you, if you had to read Empire of Storms and then had to sit through this whole book before you could get to Kingdom of Ash, I'm not sure I would finish the series. The cliffhanger at the end of Empire of Storms is diabolical. There are also some hilarious moments brought on by the tandem read. Whoever worked these out, you're a comedic genius. I'll put a link to the tandem read guide I followed in the description if you're interested in doing it. But my overarching thoughts on the series as a whole is that it's wonderful. It's wholesome, it's heart-wrenching. It made me think about the way that I treat people in my life. There are huge themes on courage and how sometimes you just have to do the hard thing. I get goosebumps just thinking about Selena's character arc, and I get emo thinking about the way that Kingdom of Ash ends. Also, Dorian is absolutely my favorite character. If I had to make a list of my top 3, 5, 10 characters of all time, he would be on there. Every single list. Next, I'm going to talk about the Ruinous Love Trilogy. Butcher and Blackbird is a rom-com about 2 serial killers. What more can I say? It was silly, it was gory, do not take any of the trigger warnings lightly. Also, this was the first time I read a book with trigger warnings at the beginning. It really gets you into the headspace for what you're about to read. There's pining, there's angst, there's a scene in a Texas farm that still gives me the heebie-jeebies. I'm a big fan of horror movies, and I go to Halloween Horror Nights every year, and that felt like a moment out of a haunted house in that Texas farmhouse. Okay, but back to the pining. Rowan, hard name to live up to, if you know, you know, is the king of it. I love when a character isn't afraid to wear their heart on their sleeve. And this book really is a romantic comedy. I laughed out loud at least twice. Usually my laughs are just an exhale out of my nose, but I actually laughed at some of the scenes here. The banter was fabulous. The wit was there. I totally enjoyed that read. And the follow-up, Leather and Lark, was just as fun. It follows Lark, who is Sloane, the female main character from Butcher and Blackbird, Sloane's best friend, and her love interest. I don't want to give too much away, but if you read Butcher and Blackbird, you'll figure out the MMC to Lark's FMC pretty quick. This is shaping up to be a 3-star series for me. The writing is fun, again the banter is there, and I'm looking forward to picking up Scythe and Sparrow when it comes out February 11th, I believe. I will also be getting that book from my local library. Okay. let's talk about Yellowface by R.F. Kuang, a book that is somehow equal parts deeply uncomfortable and wildly entertaining. First off, this book is fun. Like, I devoured it in a couple of sittings. It's sharp, it's biting, and Kuang does this amazing job of pulling you into a story that's basically like watching a car crash in slow motion. But here's the thing, I also felt like I was being hit over the head with the point. You know, like, do you get it? Do you get it? Yes, I get it. I promise I do. And while the social commentary is definitely important and well done, I wish it was woven in a little more subtly into some parts. Our main character, June, is one of the most unlikable characters I've read in a long time. She's messy, she's morally bankrupt, and honestly, she's kind of the worst, which makes for a really interesting story. You're in her head the whole time, watching her justify some truly awful decisions, and it's uncomfortably real. Now, the ending. Without spoilers, I'll just say it kind of loses the plot. I feel like the story builds up so much tension, and then the conclusion just didn't quite land for me. It wasn't bad, but it didn't hit as hard as I expected. Still, Yellowface does something really interesting. It feels like the kind of book we are going to look back on in 10, maybe 20 years and say, wow, this is a snapshot of the publishing industry and the world at the time. If you're looking for a book that's entertaining, thought-provoking, and will definitely make you feel a little uncomfortable, this is it. Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. I picked up Catch-22 as an attempt to get into classics, and this seemed interesting enough. And while reading it, I definitely felt like I was back in school. That's usually how I feel whenever I pick up anything that's satirical. My whole brain is on to pick up the context and metaphors and themes, etc. And this book really is just satire and themes. There isn't really a plot per se. It's all just short anecdotal stories that weave together to make a bigger story. It's stream of conscience in storytelling, like when someone starts telling you a story and starts going off on tangents and giving context to the original story. That's basically this. I actually recommended this book to my husband to read for this year, and I forgot how much of a learning curve it is to get used to this style of writing. It's chafed him a lot more than it chafed me. I think I just trusted Joseph Heller and the opinion of millions of copies that this book has sold to get me through this chunker. But yeah, my husband is right there on that page. Finishing this book felt so rewarding. The storylines all mostly start to make sense by the end. You get a grasp on the point of satire that they're trying to make on war, bureaucracy, chains of command, etc., etc. And it's all written with very intimate knowledge of the system. Joseph Heller was a World War II veteran, and this book comes across as like his therapy, dealing with what he had to deal with on the page. Next up is Funny Story by Emily Henry. I think that each FMC in Emily Henry's books are like someone you can relate to or someone who embodies you, like a horoscope, and Daphne is my girl. There's one quote from this story that felt like Emily Henry took a thought right out of the deepest, darkest corners of my brain, and I'll share it here because whatever. You can't force a person to show up, but you can learn a lesson when they don't. Trust people's actions, not their words. Don't love anyone who isn't ready to love you back. Let go of the people who don't hold on to you. Don't wait on anyone who's not in a rush to get to you. And Miles, he's the best book boyfriend Emily Henry has written. He's attentive and patient and in tune with his emotions. Although his laid-back nature contrasts with Daphne's very buttoned-up persona, they really shine when they're together. They communicate so well with each other, their banter is fun, and they develop this genuine friendship before anything else happens. That's a good foundation for their relationship in the latter half of the book. So, disclaimer, I haven't read all of Emily Henry's romances. People We Meet on Vacation is what I have left, which I think is getting adapted into a movie soon. I'll read it before that happens, but for right now, Funny Story sits right at the top of my Emily Henry rankings, right behind Beach Read, which I kind of want to reread later. TBD. The Wishing Game by Meg Shaffer. I'll be so real with you, I don't remember much of what happens in this book, but I remember the vibes, and the vibes were positive. However, past me did write a review on Goodreads, and I'm just gonna read it to you now because it was my thoughts freshly after reading the book. Here you go. This is a judge a book by its cover moment. I spotted it in the new fiction section of Barnes & Nobles because the cover was adorable, and it didn't disappoint. The book itself is as charming as its cover. One word to describe this book: whimsical. Shaffer draws inspiration from the likes of Lewis Carroll and Roald Dahl, infusing the narratives with dreams, wishes, and the promise of happy endings. It's light and breezy with a guaranteed happy ending from the start, even though the characters' obstacles call for nothing short of a miracle to be resolved. Lucy Hart, the protagonist, was fun to follow. Her struggles with finances in her mid-20s are all too relatable. I appreciate the parallels between the stories written by fictional Jack Masterson and Lucy's own journey throughout the book. While the narrative might sometimes feel like it's holding your hand, it remains enjoyable nonetheless. This is a book that caters to adults who enjoy YA fiction but crave a touch of deeper themes often found in adult novels. Overall, it was an enjoyable experience, a case of the right book at the right time for me. I couldn't have said it better myself. There you go. Oh boy. We're getting into my one and only one-star read, and that is Tender is the Flesh by Agustina Basterica. This was the most disappointing moment of my reading journey in 2024, which hurts because I wanted to love this book so much. This was such an interesting concept. The story here is that a virus has made all animal meat inedible, and the government's solution is to make cannibalism legal. Our main character Marcos is dealing with a lot. His wife left him, his father has dementia, his sister is obnoxious, and on top of all that, he manages the local processing plant for this special meat. And he remembers a world before this transition, so he's coming to grips with this new, very odd reality. The story really picks up when he's gifted a live specimen to keep at home, like the highest grade of this special meat, and he begins to develop some empathy for her, treating her like a human for the first time in her life. Fascinating concept, right? Okay, so here are all the things that I liked. There was a major plot twist halfway through the book. You can kind of see it coming, but the reveal is still shocking. And the ending is crazy. I'm telling you, the last 2 pages had my jaw actually on the floor. Now, here are the things that I didn't like. Those 2 things that I just mentioned liking about the plot, after thinking about them for maybe 10 seconds, you realize that they were purely there for shock value and didn't really add anything to the story. Something else I didn't like was that this is the perfect example of a story telling you everything and not showing you much. It was very passive writing, and I think that could have been the fact that it's a translated work, but I don't think that's a valid excuse. I don't really understand why this is a pitfall in any book published from any majoring publishing house in this day and age. It was so much telling that I actually thought it was a stylistic choice to demonstrate how the character was maybe disassociating from the events in his life because he felt so shocked and out of control in this weird new reality. But the more I read, the more I figured that that might have just been passive writing. Also, the metaphor that this book was trying to communicate didn't really land for me. Not that the metaphor wasn't clear. The issue was actually that it was way too clear. It was insanely obvious, which made it disappointing. Personally, for me, when cannibalism is used as a metaphor in any form of art or literature, it requires some deeper commentary, and this just felt superficial. I think this could have been a longer book. Honestly, if they had like another 100 to 200 pages to flesh it out, no pun intended, this would have been an important piece of work. Instead, it feels unfinished. This feels like it could have gone up there with the 1984's Animal Farm's Fahrenheit 451s of literature, and instead it falls on its face a little bit. Next is On Writing by Stephen King. This is my first book about writing, and it won't be my last. Reading about the thoughts and processes of a master of their craft is always fascinating. I was dabbling with the idea of writing a book myself, and this guide was short, sweet, and to the point, and most of all, inspiring. Although I haven't written my own book, and I don't know if I ever will, my day-to-day writing has improved a lot. It inspired me to write more, which has allowed me to improve by way of practice and has revitalized my confidence in communication. In a world where a lot of people rely on AI tools to compose things for them, I can say that I feel better about my own writing than I do about anything any AI tool can spit out for me. And this book is part of that reason. Uglies by Scott Westerfeld. I remember picking up this book in the 7th grade because it was in my homeroom teacher's classroom library, and then I read it in one day between school and a dermatology appointment. I have vivid memories of sitting in my dermatologist's waiting room with my mom, and then at home after speeding through my homework. The plot twists, I did not see them coming. I didn't see them coming as a 12-year-old. It rocked my world. Last year, Netflix finally released their movie adaptation of this story with Joey King, and I haven't watched it yet. I didn't even pick this up because the movie was coming out. It just felt like I owed it to my 12-year-old inner self to pick this up and see if it hit as much as it did 15 years ago. And honestly, it was okay. The pacing of it was a little funky. I think the ending was rushed, but it was still as immersive as I remember it being. The concept of a world where plastic surgery has been so normalized that it's actually mandatory for maintaining world peace, that's a ridiculous sentence, but it feels like a world that's not so far off. We're like one major event away from this reality. There are a lot of themes of self-acceptance, friendship, introspection, societal pressures, and the consequences of being so connected to societal trends. Again, this feels so applicable to the world currently. Side note, this is how I want my dystopian novels to make me feel, like an uncomfortable connection to society because it is a criticism of society. But yeah, I enjoyed this reread. I'll probably pick up the sequel, Pretties, sometime this year. Next is the second Ali Hazelwood book I read, which is Love Theoretically. I was due for a fluffy romance at this point in the year, and Ali Hazelwood felt like the right move. This was another quirky plot. Elsie, our FMC, is an adjunct professor trying to go for tenure. Outside the classroom, she makes ends meet by offering her services as a fake girlfriend. And she's really good at this because she is a grade A people pleaser. She's got a talent for molding herself to what people need her to be. Her life is very precariously balanced, and it all comes crashing down when she finds out that the older brother of her favorite client, favorite because they have developed a bit of a friendship, is the guy who ruined her mentor's career. Yikes. The MMC, Jack, is under the impression that Elsie is a librarian, so when she shows up with this impressive CV of research, he's obviously very confused and very suspicious. He's actually mostly concerned for his brother because his conclusion is that if Elsie is lying about her job, then what else could she be lying about? Very much the protective older brother. Anyways, Elsie's people-pleasing tendencies are no match for Jack's patience and stubbornness. When he picks up on her tendencies to put others ahead of her, he challenges her to dig deep and discover what she really wants, to learn how to say no, how to put her foot down and stand up for what she believes in. And Jack seems to be the only person that Elsie doesn't want to mold herself to. He infuriates her enough because of his history with her mentor and the fact that they sit on opposite ends of physics theory that she wants to spite him more than anything. This is very much an opposites attract situation. Is it cheesy? Absolutely. But I love cheese. And one thing about Ali Hazelwood is that she's going to write banter and humor. I love when characters that are supposed to be falling in love actually feel like they're falling in love through their dialogue. This got a 4 out of 5 stars from me. I'm working through my Ali Hazelwood backlog. Speaking of working through the backlog, next book, Not in Love by Ali Hazelwood. I picked up Not in Love in the same month as Love Theoretically, so I guess I was just going through it in June. I also keep track of the days that I read, and I finished both of these books in 2 days, which usually means that I started reading in the afternoon one day and then read until, you guessed it, 2 in the morning. If I remember correctly, there were a lot of disclaimers going into Not in Love, specifically that it's more of an erotic romance as opposed to Ali Hazelwood's regular rom-coms, and somehow people were still complaining about the fact that there was a lot of intimacy scenes. So in case you hadn't heard, or I don't know, I guess didn't believe in the disclaimer, this book is very spicy. They get into it like in the first chapter, I'm pretty sure. And later on in the book, there's an intimacy scene that goes on for chapters. Multiple chapters. All that being said, I really enjoyed it. It was the perfect book to escape into for a few hours. Rue and Eli are complex characters. They're a little older, in like their late 20s, early 30s, so they have more baggage that they unpack throughout the course of this book. Rue struggles with food insecurity, and Eli has an ex-fiance, amongst other things. Their main conflict is that Eli and his business partners want to buy up the startup company that Rue works for. So there's a little bit of workplace romance, a little bit of she's off limits, a little bit of lust, a little bit of obsessing, especially from Eli's point of view. Oh, and it's dual point of view. My current Ali Hazelwood ranking is bride, not in love, and then love theoretically. I love how she writes, especially these last few books. She seems to have honed her niche of STEM romances with quirky, nerdy, lovable characters. I did my absolute best to avoid spoilers for this series, especially when I started getting really into reading and started getting served a lot of book recommendations via my algorithms. I knew I was going to get to this series eventually, but wanted to go into it as fresh as possible. All I knew was that this was set in an urban fantasy setting. Bryce and Hunt seemed to be the main couple, and that Rune Danon was the crown prince of the Valbaran Fae. That's it. That's all I knew. As I've been putting together my thoughts for this wrap-up, I've been referencing the synopses on Goodreads and the back of the books to make sure I'm not giving too much away. And when I looked at the one for House of Earth and Blood, I realized I've never seen it before. Why? Because there's a major spoiler in the literal first sentence of the synopsis. The first sentence of the synopsis happens pretty much at the beginning of the book. And I guess I was protecting myself so much from the spoilers that I protected myself from the synopsis. All that to say, I was hooked within the first 30 pages, and I don't think anybody talks about the first 30 pages enough. I'm also not going to talk about it because it's intense and you should experience it yourself without warning, but the rest of this very thick book takes you on what I can only call a buddy cop adventure set in a magical city. There are demons, there are mer people, witches, fae, angels, humans, and otters that deliver your mail. The world here is kind of campy when you think about it, and the characters, I'm thinking specifically about Bryce, have a sense of humor. There's good banter between her and Hunt, as well as the other characters. I like how Bryce and Hunt's relationship develops. There's a trope there of forced proximity where, of course, they're forced to deal with and come to accept their differences. Their friendship, even around their attraction to each other, feels very real, very believable. I also need to commend the world building here, not just the city, continent map part of the world, but the history, the lore. There is deep history. Hunt, for example, is over 200 years old, and we get to learn about his early life, which is important to the story overall, not just in passing. Like, we get to hear it, and I like when fantasy novels feel like that, like I'm learning actual history, like the author wasn't afraid to play with the scope of time. It feels big, for lack of a better word. I felt the same about Mistborn, which I'll get to later. One more note on House of Earth and Blood. In true SJM fashion, the ending of this book was insane. It still gives me chills. I still think about it every once in a while, and the best way I can describe it is just cinematic. I could imagine it happening in my head as if it were a movie, and it went on for at least like 150 pages. I was emotionally exhausted by the time I finished this book. Let me grab the other one. Now, House of Sky and Breath, boom, picks up a few months after the events of the first book, and I also really enjoyed it. I will say that this book starts to bring in more side character perspectives, which I like. It continued to add to the scale of the story, and I think that was smart on SJM's part. It keeps the story fresh as we meet new characters and situations. The ending of this one is also insane, and I'm not going to say much about it because big spoilers. And finally, House of Flame and Shadow, which was published in 2024. I think because I got to jump straight into House of Flame and Shadow, I wasn't as let down by the book as most people were. Honestly, it's not that bad. I could see how if I waited years for this, I would be a little disappointed. It is a lot of walking through caves. It's definitely not the strongest of the three, but I had a good time reading it. I think this book sets up the next book, which I think is the last book, for a really epic conclusion to the series. Next is A Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson. I read the whole trilogy in 2024. I've never read a crime mystery thriller book that has as many pictures and diagrams and transcripts as this book and this book series does. That's one aspect of the series that will always stick with me, the attention to detail. Not only did including the evidence immerse me as a reader, making me feel like this was a real case, it also characterized Pip, our main character, as someone who is fact-driven, someone who always shows their work. So it was easy to follow her logic because it was easy to trust her process. A Good Girl's Guide to Murder follows Pip Fitz-a-Moby as she tries to uncover the truth behind the murder of Andy Bell. Allegedly, it was her boyfriend Sal Singh who did it, and then he himself. But those details have never sat right with Pip. And since her hometown is small, everyone knows everyone has secrets, everyone gossips. Pip has picked up some details over the years that make her question this case. The twist at the end was one that I saw coming, but about 50%. You can piece together part of it, but the second half is kind of wild and will take you for a loop. I guarantee it. There's also parts of the story that are kind of dark. There are characters you're going to hate. There's one scene early on that was kind of creepy and very much has this book living up to the thriller genre. And there are characters here that are both complex in complicated normal ways and dark twisted ways. And those stories get taken into the next 2 books in this trilogy. Something else I'll always remember about this series is how genius Holly Jackson was at making this trilogy feel like one complete body of work. Sometimes it feels like books in a trilogy kind of stand on their own. They're dealing with completely different issues that don't connect. This was a satisfying trilogy to finish because although we're dealing with 3 different arcs, they're all connected and it brought it to a satisfying conclusion. I will say that in the other 2 books, towards the end of the first book and in the other 2 books, you start to see a shift in Pip. She very much starts as the good girl, and as she encounters these cases and encounters the darker side of humanity, she starts to kind of lose faith in the good. The journey that she goes on just in her own mind, in her internal monologues, is really fascinating. And by the end, in As Good as Dead, she's facing some really dark stuff, and there's a scene in As Good as Dead that really had me, like, it gripped me in the best way because it was beautifully written. Not beautifully written. It was well written. Beautifully is not a good word to describe it, but it was intense. Yeah, she really goes through her paces in that last book. So overall, it's a 5-star series for me. I would recommend it, even if you see YA and don't think that you'll take it seriously because it's YA, dispel those notions. You're going to want to read this if you're a fan of thrillers. The Art Thief by Michael Finkel. This was surprisingly fun since it feels more like a novel. You get the satisfaction of learning about current events while enjoying a very well-written narrative. There are moments where I had to stop just to admire the writing. Stephen Britweiser's story is incredibly intriguing, and it's clear that Finkel did extensive research to uncover all the fascinating details. He's such a unique character that it's hard to believe he exists, which adds to the fascination. His story, along with those of the people in his life, stayed with me days after I finished this book. I will say that the last 50 pages upset me in the way that only real-life tragedies can. Also, small spoiler, it's shocking how lax museum security is. I never considered how much they have to compromise to keep the museum experience intimate for visitors, and how much they have to compromise to keep exhibitions fresh. Budget issues really do affect every aspect of our society. I speak from experience. Siege and Storm by Leigh Bardugo. It's the second book in the Shadow and Bone trilogy. I honestly have no idea where this series is going. I know nothing about it besides what I have read so far. I have thankfully avoided spoilers. Well, except for one spoiler, but I don't think it's that big of a deal. And I'm not gonna lie, I mostly picked up the series because I eventually want to read Six of Crows, and it seems like the majority opinion online is that you really should read Shadow and Bone before you read Six of Crows. Ravka, the fictional country that this series mostly takes place in, is war-torn and literally torn by the Shadowfold, which is like an impenetrable wall of darkness crawling with monsters. Our main character, Alina, is introduced to us as this young, insecure girl who's pretty average. She's an orphan, and the only constant in her life has been her best friend, Mal. In the first book, Shadow and Bone, Alina goes through a lot. I honestly forgot a lot of what she went through because at this point I read book 1 almost 2 years ago, but putting together my thoughts on this series so far reminded me of everything she experiences in Shadow and Bone. A lot of very traumatic character building moments. It's revealed that she has this rare power, so obviously she becomes very important to a very powerful character, aptly named the Darkling. There's an insane twist about halfway through Shadow and Bone that I didn't see coming at all, and from that point on, the tone of the series shifts. Siege and Storm picks up a few weeks after the events of Shadow and Bone, and we're thrown into action pretty immediately. This book's pacing is a lot faster, especially in the beginning and the end. I will say that there's a bit of a lull halfway through. We were back in exposition waiting mode there. Full transparency, this book would have been a 3-star read had it not been for the introduction of one character. They really carried the story and added some interesting conflict. Next is Daydream by Hannah Grace. This is a warm hug personified. If you were looking for a cozy hockey romance series, guaranteed happy endings without the miscommunication trope looming over your head, this is it. Daydream is the third and final book in the Maple Hills series, the first book being Icebreaker. They're interconnected, standalone romance books, which means you don't necessarily have to read them all or read them in order, but you're gonna want to. Out of the 3, I think Icebreaker is still my favorite, but the 2 other books, Wildfire and Daydream, are deliciously fun to read. Daydream follows Henry, who's been around since Icebreaker and has been one of the most beloved characters since he first stepped on the page. These books are dual POV, so you get both the male and female perspectives, and finally getting into Henry's perspective was very interesting. He's got a lot going on up there. In Daydream, Henry is struggling to balance school, hockey, and his personal life. He's a procrastinator, which means he is just like me, and he's gotten himself into a situation where he is in dire need of help. Enter Hallie, or Haley, who offers to tutor him, but she's got a lot going on too. Her own schoolwork, a job, a book club she's managing, and a novel she's trying to write. If you're a book lover, which I'm guessing you are because you're here, you're gonna vibe with Hallie. She's just like you and me. Anyways, Hallie feels a little stuck in her writing because she doesn't have much life experience to pull from. So in exchange for her help with the class that he's failing, Henry promises to help her with those life experiences she needs. Henry and Hallie develop a very sweet friendship, and they work together to reach their goals. They cherish their friendship so much that they're actively trying not to fall for each other, which is lame, and we know how that's gonna end up. But again, no miscommunication on their part. They're the example of strong communication. Sometimes I think we get a little too much communication, but that's not me complaining. I much prefer that over the alternative. Of course, it wouldn't be a romance without some sort of third act breakup, which we do get here. I honestly don't remember if it's an actual breakup, but there is some conflict that they need to work through. Again, this is like a hug personified. I recommend this series if you love romance and haven't gotten around to it yet. Next is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. This was weird in the best way. I didn't like a single character in this book, except for one, and that's my girl, Judy Poovey. Everyone else was either frustratingly pretentious, insecure, or all of the above. And I did find myself real life slamming my head into a wall at some decisions that some of these characters made. I do think that this is a book that's better if you go into it blind. I didn't know a single thing of what was gonna happen, and it was great, and weird, and frustrating, but great. Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. Spectacular. Give me 14 of them right now. That's really it. There's nothing I could say about this series that would add to all the praise that it already gets. I'll definitely be reading Well of Ascension this year. Gone by Michael Grant. I was obsessed with this book series in middle school and high school, but I honestly couldn't take the emotional damage from what happens in these books. I never actually finished the series when I was younger because it caused me too much angst. As a full-grown adult, I think I can handle it now. I think I've definitely read worse at this point. Gone takes place in California, in Perdido Beach, which is a beach town, where one day everyone over the age of 15 disappears. There's no cell reception, no internet, no way of getting help. On top of that, they start to realize some funky stuff is going on, like some kids are mutating, and as they realize that their adults might not be coming back, we get a very Lord of the Flies-esque situation. Remember what I said about being able to handle this as an adult? After reading this, I'm honestly not so sure. This is classified as YA, but it's not a fluffy YA. There are challenging scenes and situations, and I really think it's only YA because it's a young cast of characters. We get a bunch of different POVs, and there are varying degrees of maturity and life experience that Michael Grant explores through these characters. So, really in-depth read. There's a little bit of silliness and a lot of coming of age, but at its core, this is a dark and sinister story. And I remember some plot lines in the later books, but not enough to really spoil my journey at this point. And it gets dark, folks. I'm actually really excited to keep reading. It's a 9-book series, 6 from the original series, and 3 more that happen after a short time jump. I didn't want to read too much into those because I didn't want to risk a major spoiler, but I do want to read the 9 books, so I'll keep you updated on those. 7 Days in June by Tia Williams. I was deep in a reading slump when I started 7 Days in June, and it was the perfect book to pick me back up again. This is about 2 authors with a shared history. Ava, who writes vampire erotica, and Shane, who's a reclusive, enigmatic, award-winning literary author. They meet one night 20 years after their original fling, and the chemistry is still there. The title, 7 Days in June, refers to the 7 days they were together in the past and the 7 days they get together in the present. Now, the romance, 10 out of 10. I loved it. I don't think I've ever read a second chance romance, at least not recently enough to remember, but if they do it like this, I want more of it. This book is so much more than a second chance romance, though. It dives into themes of trauma, generational and otherwise, healing, and the struggles that Black women face in the publishing industry. Ava's journey as a single mom and best-selling author trying to balance her career with her chronic illness was both inspiring and heartbreaking. On the other hand, the story is also hilarious. I laughed out loud plenty of times, and I think the humor balanced out the dark themes enough to keep the story flowing. Next is This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Mohtar and Max Gladstone. This book is short, so this review is going to be short. This gets points for being one of the most creative when it comes to world building. It also gets points for being a cutting edge project. These were 2 authors that co-authored this book, each of them taking on the role of one of the protagonists, which I think is so interesting. The prose is elegant and quick. They really didn't mince words. There is 0 filler. Magnolia Parks by Jessa Hastings. People are obsessed with this series, and unfortunately, I can't relate. Magnolia Parks was pitched to me as Gossip Girl, but in London, and that's a pretty apt description. Not in the there's someone in our friend group that's leaking our secrets way, but in the young rich kids making insane decisions way. It's a completely different experience to watch characters in a show or a movie make bad decisions and be toxic than it is to read about it, because wow, this hurt. Being in Magnolia and BJ's point of views as they're experiencing life and relationships, it was painful, and I did not love how it felt. I do commend Jessa Hastings for having the ability to write such flawed characters, because I don't think I could ever come up with something like this. It makes for great drama and gossip-like storytelling, and the prose here is also one of the most beautiful I've ever read. It's so romantic, which just adds another layer of frustration, because why can't they channel that into being happy. They have such strong feelings for each other, BJ and Magnolia, and it's truly painful to see how much they sabotage it, most of the time seemingly willingly. Yeah, this is definitely not a love story to aspire to. If a man ever treated me like this, I would probably punch them in the face and never speak to them again. The end. No book. I don't know if I'll continue with the series. The next book is Daisy Hates, and I think she's a little more relatable to me. She does get introduced in Magnolia Parks, and Daisy just seems to have her head on her shoulders. She's not taking flack from anybody, and I might be able to relate to that. We'll see. Next is Winter Street by Ellen Hildebrand. This is both my first Ellen Hildebrand book and my first Christmas book. Since I haven't heard many people talk about this book in particular, I'll give you the rundown. Winter Street is about Kelly Quinn and his family. Kelly is the owner of Nantucket's Winter Street Inn and the proud father of 4 children. There's Patrick, the hedge fund manager, Kevin, the bartender, Ava, the school teacher, and Bart, who is the only child of Kelly's second marriage. Bart recently joined the Marines. On Christmas Eve, Kelly walks in on Mitzi, his second wife, kissing Santa Claus, or the guy who's playing Santa Claus at the inn's annual party. He's been Santa every year for the past 12 years, and all the kids are going through their own major struggles when they find out that their dad's second wife cheated on him. But they all, including Kelly's ex-wife, set aside their struggles and differences to help Kelly with the annual Christmas party. There is a love triangle, an unplanned pregnancy, federal crime, a bathtub fire, and a second chance romance, and other things I'm probably forgetting. It's truly trope bingo. I generally enjoyed it. It was like reading the script of a Hallmark Christmas movie. 3 out of 5 stars. And last but not least, Realmbreaker by Victoria Aveyard. The first 26 pages of this book completely sold me on the entire series. It was tense, gripping, and set the stakes so well that I was instantly hooked. I also can't believe this book is actually YA. More than once I had to stop and check the genre just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. The storytelling feels elevated, something fans of adult fantasy could definitely enjoy. Sure, it has moments of humor and a bit of that campy YA feel, but for the most part, the lore is deep, and some scenes are downright ruthless. Victoria Aveyard has been super open about how Lord of the Rings inspired this series, and you can absolutely see those influences in the best way possible. There's no blatant copying, but you get the same grand scope and an unlikely group of allies banding together to save the world on the brink of actual destruction. Expect political corruption, betrayal, and a whole lot of secrets. Also, let's talk about the map. This is one of the most detailed world maps I've ever seen. Even after finishing the book, I still found myself pulling up a digital version of Allward just to piece together everything. So if you're into epic fantasy with rich world building and high stakes, Realmbreaker is definitely worth picking up. And that's it, the 44 books I read in 2024. Let me know if you've read any of them, and if so, which ones were your favorites? Maybe some were your 5-star reads? I had a great time going down my reading memory lane, although it took up a big chunk of my afternoon, and now I have to put all these books back where I found them. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more bookish content whenever I post. You can also follow me over on Fable, where we can chat about books. I'll leave the link to that in the description, but it's the same handle as this channel, Biblicore and Mint. See you next time. Happy reading.